Tim was very disoriented in front of his class. He just didn't seem himself.
Excuse me. I'm really not with it today.
The first thought that came to mind is, what the f?
Shocking details are revealed tonight about how far a Bellingham woman is accused of going to kill her boyfriend.
The most bizarre case in the whole state of Washington.
An extremely unhealthy mother-daughter relationship.
Hello, could I have a recipe to kill your son?
You go shoot him, and my mommy will be right here.
Somebody's gonna die.
I was home getting ready for bed when I got called out. A college professor, Timothy Bowman, hadn't showed up for work, and they were concerned about his welfare.
I was a co-worker of Tim's. He wasn't answering the phone, and it was very unlike him not to even call and tell us he was sick. We walked around and knocked on the doors, got no response. We were trying to understand what had happened, if he had fallen and knocked himself unconscious.
But something told me it was more than just somebody not showing up for work.
When we arrived, the entire house was secured. A neighbor provided information that there was a window on that second floor that didn't lock. And we had to gain access through that unlocked window.
It was slowly dawning on me that this was quite serious.
Detectives arrive at Timothy Bowman's home and start looking to see where he could possibly be in the home. They make their way to the bedroom.
We see the victim lying on the bed with a single gunshot wound to the back of his head. It was pretty obvious that it was a close contact wound.
The bed sheets were soaked with blood.
Skull fragments, brain matter also found on the bed.
The crime scene is nothing short of grisly and gruesome. When you've got something so egregious as a point-blank shooting or an execution-style murder, it's very deliberate, very personal.
Even the most hardened law enforcement officers are not going to forget that.
On Monday, March 4th, Tim Bowman was found shot to death in his own bed. Bowman did not show up for work, and officers were asked to check on his welfare.
You don't expect, at 43 years old, for your brother to get checked out.
My parents were destroyed by the news. You know, no parent wants to have to bury their kid.
I felt like something has just been torn out of your heart, and it left a big empty feeling.
We were all so stunned that he was gone. There are 6 boys in the family. Tim was the oldest.
We were very close as kids growing up.
This one's one I like. Big smile.
He was a role model in a lot of ways. He was always friendly and kind and had almost like a Labrador kind of personality.
He was a great athlete. He ran 2 Boston marathons.
He was on the wrestling team.
He had to wrestle with 5 brothers quite a bit.
Encouraging us to stand our ground.
Tim had always had an interest in and was teaching Native American culture.
He was a good son and a good brother.
Tim had a common-law wife, Naomi Kenny, who was 31.
They had 2 children. And at the time of the murder, Naomi was actually pregnant with their 3rd child.
When we arrived, all of the doors were locked. It would be very unusual for a killer to enter the house, shoot and kill Mr. Bowman, and then lock the door on his way out. We have to consider suicide, but when we don't find the weapon, we rule that out. We searched the remaining part of the house, looking for any additional victims. Found none, nor did we find any other occupants of the house. We do a canvass in the neighborhood. One of the neighbors said that she had seen Naomi and the kids during the weekend, but not since the weekend. It's vitally important that we talk to her.
But there's a problem. No one seems to know where Naomi is.
Naomi Kinney and Tim met in Oregon. She was helping on the track team that he was associated with as a coach.
Naomi had a falling out with her mother, Judith. She had a tumultuous relationship with her daughter. Judith kicked her out of the home.
Naomi had nowhere to go and was looking for a place to live. My brother was one of those types of people who would give the shirt off of his back. It ended up they not only shared a home, but they shared a bedroom too.
Naomi was in her 20s. The age gap was 12 years. She was totally infatuated with him. He's the one for me. I know he's the one for me. She really loved the fact that she thought Tim needed her.
My brothers and I and my dad went out to Washington.
We didn't know what was going on in Tim's life at that time.
We met Mr. Bowman's family. They had no idea who would want to harm him. We tell them that Naomi is the person that we wanted to speak with the most.
The sheriff said, I'm going to have to interrupt our conversation here. We just have an incoming call.
They just adjourned the meeting. We didn't know what was going on.
I went to answer the phone, and it was Naomi Kinney. My heart's racing, adrenaline is going. Naomi had heard that something had happened to Tim Bowman. She asked us, is it true? Is he dead? She was at a safe house for battered women. She said that she had been the victim of abuse at the hands of Mr. Bowman. Naomi said that she left her home at about 7 a.m. the day before. We found Tim.
Naomi said that she had a black eye, which Tim had given her.
She tells them that her relationship with Tim was very troubled, and it had been for quite a number of years, and that she had finally had the courage and strength to walk away from that relationship.
This changes the way investigators view the case. But this wasn't the first time detectives had heard about the abuse.
As we're looking around the house, we discover something very significant in this case. We see a note on the dining room table.
A letter purportedly written by Naomi in which she talks about abuse in the home.
I've taken the kids to my mom's, and I'll be seeking a restraining order against you. The note also said that there was a strange man in the neighborhood, presumably wanting to do business with the victim.
It raises a lot of questions. Who was Tim? Is Tim leading a double life?
Does Tim have a violent side? Does Tim have a drug problem? Is Tim involved in criminal activity?
Are there any other people out there that wanted Tim Bowman dead?
And we went to the safe house to interview Naomi. I'm thinking that hopefully this case will break wide open. When we meet Naomi, what she told us about the abuse was consistent with what she put in the letter. She did have a black eye, which she said that was caused by Tim Bowman striking her. And she claimed a shady character lurking around the neighborhood was responsible for Tim Bowman's death. We expected her to be very distraught, crying, very upset, and she wasn't that at all.
Here's a woman who's trying to escape being abused and battered for the sake of not only her life, but the life of her children. She felt she had no choice but to flee.
There were times when they were happy together.
But Tim and Naomi had the kids early on, and they were in disagreement about how to raise the kids. The relationship really escalated into a lot of arguing and yelling. They slowly drove each other nuts.
It was at this time Tim got a job opportunity. So he left the kids and Naomi behind in Oregon and moved on to Washington.
He was offered the position at Northwest Indian College. He thought that that was a new start.
They realized that long-term parenting together wasn't going to work.
He was making trips back to visit the kids, and he was trying to get control of the situation and make things better for both of the boys.
He wanted out of the relationship. But Naomi was never going to accept that. She was going to follow him, and she was going to prove to him that he loved her.
She showed up on his doorstep, forced her way in, and things started all over again.
Before meeting Tim, Naomi lived in Albany, Oregon with her mother, Judith.
Judith was a nurse at the local hospital.
I lived in Albany in a duplex next door to Judith. There was a swimming pool that was out in front of our duplex. And so we all kind of went out there and talked. Naomi and her mom, they were pretty tight. Judith was very controlling. Naomi was in her early 20s, but whatever her mom wanted Naomi to do, she did it.
There was an incident that Naomi relayed where when she was in her early teens, they had someone move in with them. She was instructed by Judith to do whatever she needed to do in order to keep him happy. It's extreme controlling behavior. If true, it could very well also be child abuse and a crime.
When Naomi decided to move to Washington, her mom let her know that she was very disappointed in her. After she got together with Tim, Tim had replaced Judith. It would not surprise me if Judith felt that Tim was a threat by taking Naomi away from her.
A lot of us neighbors anticipated there's going to be problems. I would not cross her at all.
Over a period of time, Tim became very concerned about the health and the welfare of the kids. Tim said Naomi didn't have those nurturing instincts. The younger of the two, he was underweight. He said he was not being cared for at night, and there were other concerns.
The living conditions that were just, it was a mess.
There wasn't even a table. There wasn't a place for the kids to play. The refrigerator was full of rotten food. There's no way for anybody to live.
During the investigation, we canvassed the neighborhood. Nobody saw a strange-looking man lurking around.
We could find nobody that could validate that this guy even existed.
There was also no evidence to suggest that Tim was into any illegal activity or that he was abusive on his part.
So when her story starts falling apart and not really adding up to what she's saying, they start to become suspicious. And detectives asked Naomi to come in.
She told us that she had studied criminal justice in college and that if she had committed a murder, she would be smart enough that she would never get caught. Hearing that comment from her was very suspicious because we hadn't accused her of having committed that crime.
Detectives asked Naomi if she'd be willing to take a polygraph test.
I told Naomi that if she had anything to do with Tim's death, she should not take the polygraph. But she immediately, without any thought or pause, said, I want to take one right now.
I'm a little under the weather today, but oh, that'd be helpful, wouldn't it? Jeez.
The university would have classes recorded. And from one of Tim's final classes, there was video of him very disoriented in front of his class. He just didn't seem himself.
I don't know how much I will say.
Tim was weak and shaky.
And I,
slurred, kind of disoriented.
I have some questions that I've been asked.
He was definitely confused.
Political systems.
It wasn't his sharp, light sense of humor.
And, excuse me.
It wasn't the way my brother would normally act.
That there are many concepts.
He told my coworker he thought he'd been poisoned.
Excuse me. I'm really not with it today.
And so my colleague took him to the hospital.
Unfortunately, they couldn't find anything in his body that was making him sick, so they sent him away.
I genuinely did not know he was in danger. I wished that I had been able to protect him.
Naomi comes in, she's wired up. We asked if she had anything to do with Tim's murder.
She said no, but the polygraph machine said deception.
Naomi ends up failing the polygraph test, which indicates to detectives that she's clearly lying. But that wasn't the end of it. When the autopsy results come in, that's when detectives strike gold.
The results of the autopsy showed he died from a single 9mm shell. A vital piece of evidence. Now we know the caliber of the weapon that was used to kill him. I asked her if she owned a firearm.
Naomi confirmed that she did have a gun and that it was a 9mm.
Naomi is now investigators' prime suspect in a homicide.
When Naomi moved up to move in with Tim in Washington, they would be on kind of a roller coaster.
She was pushing for marriage in their relationship, and Tim was not.
Naomi had a pretty hot temper.
She had a pretty violent streak in her.
There was a time when she tried to grab him by the testicles.
Tried to strangle him down there or do some kind of harm to him.
He had bruises and ended up with a double hernia and was in the hospital for a while.
There was some domestic violence, but Mr. Bowman was the victim and not the perpetrator.
And we all told him, you need to end this and get out of it. And then talk about utter shock. That moment of madness, I'd be pissed too if I was her.
Tim did make a bad mistake. Tim actually gave Naomi an engagement ring. That was a mistake. 6 months later, he asked for that engagement ring to be returned.
Probably not the wisest thing that he could have done because it made her mad, angry.
Tim became very focused on trying to get custody.
Everything changed when Tim got an attorney and she found out about it.
She didn't want to lose Tim, and she didn't want to lose her children. That was a big fear. Naomi and I went to school together. We got reacquainted when she was an adult. She came to our house, and my husband rented a movie, a suspense thriller. When we first started getting to the movie, Naomi got up and she went to the room she was staying in her house and grabbed a stuffed animal. She said that the movie scared her. And so she sat on the couch in a ball holding a stuffed animal at 22. It was not a scary movie, but her body language was that of a scared child. She had fear in her a lot. Things that she couldn't control scared her. That's because of her relationship with her mom.
Dysfunctional is too light a word to describe the relationship between Judith and Naomi. It was a dark, very dark relationship.
Naomi said that her mother was verbally and physically abusive to her as a child.
She said there was an incident where her mom knocked her down, sat on her chest, and slammed her against the floor.
Judith scares Naomi to her core. Judith, for all intents and purposes, is the monster you read about.
Judith was trying to encourage Naomi to get custody of the kids on her own. She really didn't want the kids to be with Tim.
Don't let him get away with it. She was telling her, if there's a problem, take care of it.
Something has to give. It's a powder keg situation, and it's about to blow.
We'd ask Naomi, how could it be that somebody would enter their house, shoot Tim Bowman, and lock the door as they were leaving? And she didn't have an answer for that.
Naomi's house of cards folds quickly. Naomi confesses that the black eye that she said Tim gave to her was something she did to herself.
She had taken a phone and slammed it against her eye to make it look like she had been assaulted by Tim.
It had to have hurt. But that was just the start of Naomi's confession, and that's a heck of a way to start.
Naomi decides she wants to tell detectives the truth and writes the most chilling statement.
It was like opening the floodgates.
In her shocking written statement, Naomi details that on Valentine's Day, she baked him cookies, peanut butter, and chocolate with the side of poison.
She ended up grounding up quite a number of sleeping pills and then sprinkling them into the recipe. She essentially poisoned him.
She got a chocolate recipe from my mom to surprise him as though it was a love gift.
That was off the charts to me. Hello, could I have a recipe to kill your son? Absolutely bizarre. But here's the twist. The pills didn't kill him, they just knocked him out.
It was like, yes, we have her. We have the true story. There's no suspicious man lurking in the neighborhood. We've caught the killer.
But what came next was even more astonishing. Naomi reveals to detectives that she wasn't doing this alone.
During our interview with Naomi, she said this wasn't entirely her idea. There was an accomplice.
The entire time she had someone in her ear. Her mother, Judith. In her shocking written statement, Naomi confesses to the plot to conspire and kill Tim with her mother, Judith.
Her mom convinced her that Tim was going to get custody of the kids, and they couldn't let that happen.
These two women really wanted to keep control of the children. Tim was in the way, so Tim had to go.
From the patio, I heard Judith make a point to say that he wasn't going to get away with it. You've got to stick with the plan. My youngest daughter was there with me, too, and she said that somebody's going to die.
Naomi's Valentine's confession was just the start.
The attempt to kill him with the sleeping pill in the Valentine cookie was attempt number one. Naomi told us the second attempt to kill Mr. Bowman was while he was under the influence of sleeping pills. Her mother suggested smother him with a pillow.
I'll quote, "I put a pillow on his face and leaned on it. He put his hand up and pushed it off. He went back to sleep. I called Mom back again."
Naomi told her mom, "I don't think I'm strong enough." But Judith was like, "No, you just need to do it."
Her mom would encourage her, "You need to do this." And then a third attempt on Valentine's Day, she put a plastic bag over his head. And he just brushed that off.
Tim was very disoriented. I think he realized that something was going on. He had to know that things were escalating.
The interview was very intense.
7 hours is a long time. That's mentally exhausting.
But she wanted to talk about
the different ways that she tried to kill him. Her mom would suggest another method. Attempt number 4, while he was drowsy with drugs.
Naomi lured him to the top of the stairs with the intent to push him down. She started to push him and had a change of heart. Apparently, she grabbed him, preventing him from falling.
She fails because she says she feels sorry for him.
Then she called her mother. Now what do I do?
The next attempt occurred while he is still asleep. Her mother suggests that Naomi take a sock, put a very heavy soap in it, and strike him on the head with it.
The bar of soap in the sock, it didn't work.
Tim said that he'd woken up on the floor and he didn't know what had happened.
Naomi just wasn't trying to kill him, it was pure torture. You can see in the video of his last lecture the toll that it was all taking on him.
Excuse me.
In retrospect, I know he'd been poisoned. I wish I'd known how serious it was, and I'd have insist he go to the police.
I'm really not with it today. But...
The last phone call I got from Naomi, what she told me, it stayed with me forever. She had put a rag in his gas tank and lit the rag on fire. And I asked her, why would you do that? And she says, well, he was sleeping at his car. The first thought that came to mind is, what the f?
But once again, it was a failed attempt.
We had 6 attempts on Mr. Bowman's life. 6.
You're almost in disbelief.
To target one individual and try to kill them multiple times is unheard of. It gives me the chills.
Her mother's involvement
was a continuation of the control that Judith has had on Naomi since she was a child.
Naomi was her puppet. Whatever Judith wanted, Naomi had to bow down to.
Naomi told us that she felt so relieved in finally telling the truth.
The very last act of murder, Judith was absolutely hell-bent on seeing this through.
And when all 6 attempts failed, Mom says, you're just gonna have to shoot him.
Judith tells Naomi to give Tim oral sex as a means to entice him to the bedroom and lure him to his death. He'll be relaxed, he'll be nice and sleepy, he'll be off guard. Who does that? I mean, it's absurd. It really is absurd.
They did engage in sex, and he fell asleep. But she calls her mother to tell her that she cannot bring herself to actually shoot this man. Her mother tells tells her, "You are strong, you can do this," and asks her to stay on the line while Naomi does this act. And she picked up the gun and walked into the bedroom.
You go shoot him and Mommy will be right here.
Shocking details are revealed tonight about how far a Bellingham woman is accused of going to kill her boyfriend.
Judith said, "You go do it and come back. Mommy will be right here on the phone."
I'm sure Judith could have heard the bang over the phone.
Being on the phone with her and saying, "I'll be right here," forcing her to shoot, I think evil is too light a word for Judith.
We have the true story.
Both of them got arrested and charged. A plea agreement was made between the prosecutor and her defense attorney.
Under the agreement, Kenny will be required to testify against any other person charged.
She had to provide testimony against her co-conspirator, in this case, her mother. But then there was a twist. Naomi changed her mind. She protected her mother.
She decides not to testify against Judith, which goes to show just how far she was willing to go to protect her mother. Judith. She was the mastermind behind the entire crime, so to speak. She's the one that pushed Naomi towards murdering Tim. If Naomi was in fact abused all those years by her mother, this is a way to get back at her, but she decides to protect her instead. It really doesn't make any sense.
Emotionally, I don't believe Naomi ever grew up. She always kind of did just what her mom said to do.
She was a servant to her mother's every wish. And in the end, Tim paid the price.
The charging documents read like a movie script.
You could feel the tension in the room. Several times we made eye contact. There was nothing but hatred in her eyes. No remorse and no accountability.
And how do you plead to murder in the first degree? Okay, I'm familiar with the facts, and I will make a finding of guilty of that offense.
She was sentenced to 50 years in prison.
Does she deserve to live when she took my brother's wife? I don't think so.
Naomi's mother, Judith Kinney, helped to hide the gun near her home in Oregon. Now Oregon officials are deciding what charges to file against Judith Kinney, who's in her 70s.
Naomi, she said her mom instructed her to pack up the kids and the gun, put the gun back in the safe, and bring the safe down to her in Oregon.
They bought a bag of cement and put the safe carrying the gun in this cement-filled garbage can.
Judith
took us to where the gun had been disposed of. It was a ballistic match from the gun to the shell casing that we found.
We charged Judith Kinney with conspiracy to commit murder, solicitation to commit murder, and tampering with physical evidence.
Judith. The narcissism within this woman and the ego. She was adamant that she would let Naomi take the fall.
We always felt like he would outlive us, but that didn't happen.
Being the one raising the kids after all of this and seeing the impact on these kids, removed from both parents, and that there's no winning in a situation like that. You know?
Stop and take a breath.
Offering to pay to kill her husband.
That's what your life is worth.
It's sickening.
A terrible mother.
I don't even think the devil would be that evil.
It begins with a silence that never made the evening news, a silence that settled over a narrow New York street in the fall of 1988, heavy and unnoticed, the kind of quiet that only becomes terrifying years later when people realize it was the last sound a person ever made. On that night, apartment windows glowed with television light, radios murmured through thin walls, taxis hissed past rain-darkened sidewalks, and somewhere between all of that ordinary noise, a life slipped out of focus and vanished without a scream loud enough to be remembered. By morning, the city had already moved on. By nightfall, the case had already begun its slow transformation into something colder, darker, harder to name. The victim was known, at least on paper. A name typed into police logs. An age. An address. A job title that sounded stable enough to quiet immediate alarm. A person who paid rent, answered mail, bought groceries at the same corner store. The kind of person who leaves a trace everywhere and still disappears. When neighbors were asked later what they remembered, they spoke in fragments. A door closing too late at night, footsteps on the stairs, a voice raised in frustration, maybe fear, maybe nothing at all. No one was certain. Everyone was sure it meant something. That uncertainty would become the heartbeat of the case. The apartment told a story the police couldn't immediately read. There were no overturned chairs, no blood on the walls, no obvious signs of a struggle that could be photographed and boxed as evidence. The bed was made. The sink held a single cup. A jacket hung where it always did. The absence was precise, almost careful, as if whoever left had planned to return within minutes, and never did. Detectives stood in that room and felt the pressure of a crime that refused to announce itself. No body. No weapon. No clear moment when normal life cracked open. Outside, the community reacted the way communities always do when the threat is invisible. People locked their doors earlier. Parents walked children to school. Conversations lowered in volume when strangers passed. Rumors spread faster than facts. Some said it was a lover's dispute. Others said it was a robbery gone wrong, despite nothing missing. A few whispered about organized crime, about debts, about secrets no one could prove existed. Every theory collided with the same immovable object. There was nothing solid to hold on to. Just a missing person and a clock that wouldn't stop ticking. The investigation moved fast at first, fueled by urgency and fear. Detectives knocked on doors, pulled phone records, retraced routines. They asked co-workers about last sightings, about arguments, about strange behavior that might have gone unnoticed at the time. They questioned friends who hadn't heard from the victim in days, but assumed it meant nothing. They questioned ex-partners who insisted they had moved on. Each interview added detail and removed certainty. Every answer created two new questions. The case expanded instead of narrowing. Then came the first truly unsettling discovery, a reported sighting that didn't fit. A witness claimed to have seen the victim days after they were officially reported missing, alive, hurried, glancing over their shoulder as if they were being followed. The description was convincing. The timing was wrong. Investigators argued over whether it was hope disguised as memory or a genuine crack in the timeline. If the sighting was real, everything shifted. If it wasn't, it still poisoned the narrative with doubt. As days stretched into weeks, the city's attention drifted. New crimes replaced old headlines. Other victims demanded justice louder, bloodier, more visibly. The missing person case slipped to the inside pages, then disappeared entirely. Inside the precinct, the folder thickened while momentum thinned. Leads dried up. Phone calls stopped. The silence that had opened the story now closed around it. Years passed. The apartment was cleaned, repainted, rented again. New lives moved into the same rooms where questions had once echoed. Detectives retired. Evidence was boxed and shelved. The case acquired a new label, spoken quietly, almost apologetically: cold case. Not solved. Not forgotten. Just waiting in the dark, preserved by paperwork and unresolved guilt. But cold cases have a way of breathing when no one is watching. In the decades that followed, small, strange things surfaced. A note discovered in a storage unit that couldn't be dated. A phone number scribbled on paper that no longer existed. A witness who finally spoke after years of silence, claiming fear had kept them quiet. None of it was enough. All of it was unsettling. Each fragment suggested the truth was still nearby, just out of reach, like a shadow that disappears when you turn toward it. The community aged with the mystery. People who once whispered rumors now told the story to their children as a warning. New residents heard it secondhand, stripped of names, sharpened into legend. A disappearance. A cold case. A question mark where closure should have been. The city wore it the way it wears all unresolved violence. Buried, normalized, quietly corrosive. Then 35 years later, something changed. A name resurfaced. Not a new one, but an old one, buried so deep it had almost fused with the file itself. A suspect who had been questioned once, dismissed quietly, and allowed to walk back into anonymity. Advances in technology reopened records, a detail that finally aligned with another detail. The exact sequence doesn't matter as much as the result. The case file was pulled from storage. Dust shaken loose. The word cold no longer fit. Detectives looked again, at photographs they thought they knew. Statements that once felt irrelevant now pulsed with meaning. Timelines tightened. Inconsistencies grew teeth. The suspect's past began to look less ordinary, less coincidental. Old alibis weakened under modern scrutiny. What once passed as plausible now looked carefully constructed. But even with a suspect identified, the core wound remained open. No body. No definitive proof of death. No moment that could be pointed to and named as the end. The case hovered between revelation and denial, reopening pain without sealing it. Families who had waited decades were asked to wait again. The community felt the old unease return, sharper now, edged with anger. If the truth had been this close all along, what else had been missed? The cold case was no longer silent. It whispered from every headline, every late-night news segment, every courtroom rumor. Justice seemed possible, but not guaranteed. The mystery had survived 35 years for a reason. And as investigators pushed forward, one question refused to let go, the same question that had lingered since 1988, unanswered, unburied, and still echoing through the city's memory. If the suspect is finally known, where's the victim? And what exactly happened in the silence that swallowed them? The silence that followed the reopening of the case did not feel like the quiet of abandonment anymore. It felt like the pause before impact, the kind of stillness that presses against the ears and makes every detail suddenly too loud. Inside the precinct, the old file lay open under fluorescent lights, pages yellowed, ink faded, but the weight of it unmistakably heavier than before. Names that once meant nothing now carried gravity. Dates rearranged themselves into patterns that had been invisible for decades. And at the center of it all, the suspect's name resurfaced like a body breaking the surface of dark water, not new, not unfamiliar, just ignored long enough to seem harmless. Back in 1988, the suspect had blended perfectly into the background of the city. A job that required trust. A routine that appeared predictable. A demeanor witnesses described as calm, even forgettable. He had been questioned briefly, his answers concise, his posture cooperative. No criminal record. No visible motive. In a city overflowing with louder threats, he had slipped through the cracks with ease. Now, 35 years later, those same answers read differently. Not reassuring, controlled, too precise in places where memory should have frayed. Detectives began where the original investigation had stalled, reconstructing the suspect's movements hour by hour, minute by minute. The timeline that once seemed airtight now showed hairline fractures. A receipt that placed him across town conflicted with a witness who remembered seeing him near the victim's building. A phone call logged too early. Another logged too late. Individually, they meant nothing. Together, they formed a pressure point. The kind that suggests rehearsal rather than coincidence. The victim's last known day was replayed in forensic detail. Morning routines, commutes, casual interactions no one thought to document at the time. A brief conversation with a coworker about plans that night. An unfinished errand. A missed appointment that triggered the first flicker of concern. Investigators traced each step forward until the trail dissolved into uncertainty. Somewhere between ordinary life and permanent absence, something had gone wrong. Something had been interrupted. Neighbors were re-interviewed, their memories aged, distorted, but not entirely erased. One recalled an argument in the hallway, voices low but sharp, a man speaking with authority, a woman responding with hesitation. Another remembered footsteps pacing late into the night above their ceiling, heavier than usual, stopping abruptly. At the time, no one called police. In New York, noise was currency, and this hadn't seemed worth spending it on. Now those recollections returned like fragments of a dream that suddenly felt real. The suspect's connection to the victim grew harder to dismiss. They were not strangers, despite earlier claims. Their paths crossed more often than admitted. Work-related at first, then personal. Favors exchanged. Boundaries blurred. What investigators now saw was not a random disappearance, but a relationship with leverage, tension, and the potential for collapse. The motive didn't scream from the page. It whispered, control, fear, the risk of exposure. As the case heated up, the media followed close behind. Headlines resurfaced words that had been dormant for decades. Cold case, missing, reopened, suspect identified. Old photographs of the victim circulated again, frozen smiles pulled from dusty archives and thrust back into public view. The community reacted with a mix of relief and unease. Relief that someone was finally looking. Unease at what that scrutiny might reveal about the past, about how easily a person could vanish and be forgotten. The suspect, now older, grayer, carrying the wear of years that had never held him accountable, was approached again. This time, the interview room felt smaller, the questions sharper, the tone colder. He denied everything with the same calm he displayed decades earlier, but something was different. His pauses lasted a fraction longer. His explanations wandered where they once marched straight. When confronted with inconsistencies, he didn't grow angry. He grew careful. That restraint spoke louder than outrage ever could. Investigators searched for physical evidence, knowing the odds were against them. Time destroys what guilt tries to hide. Buildings are renovated. Trash is buried beneath new layers of waste. Rivers carry secrets far from their origins. But sometimes, time preserves mistakes. A forgotten storage unit. An item never meant to last this long. A trace too insignificant to notice in 1988, now devastating under modern analysis. Every possibility was chased with urgency that bordered on desperation. The absence of a body continued to haunt the case like an accusation. Without it, every theory hovered just short of certainty. Was the victim killed in the apartment? Taken somewhere else? Persuaded to leave and never allowed to return? Each scenario demanded its own set of evidence, its own impossible recovery. And yet, the lack of remains had not prevented the case from evolving into something darker. In some ways, it made it worse. The unknown allowed every fear to coexist. Family members, long resigned to uncertainty, were pulled back into the storm. They answered questions they had already answered decades ago, reopened wounds that never truly healed. Some clung to hope, insisting the victim could still be alive, somewhere beyond reach. Others wanted only the truth, no matter how brutal. Closure had become a concept rather than a destination, something discussed but never delivered. As pressure mounted, so did resistance. The suspect's legal representation pushed back hard, challenging the reliability of old memories, the credibility of witnesses recalling events from another lifetime. They framed the reopening as desperation, a department trying to rewrite history to mask its earlier failures. The argument resonated with some. After all, 35 years is a long time to wait for certainty. Doubt grows easily in that kind of space. Still, the investigation pressed forward. Detectives followed a lead that had been dismissed early on, a strange one, involving a late-night drive outside the city, a route that made no sense for the suspect's stated plans. At the time, it was chalked up to error. Now, satellite imagery, traffic data, and reconstructed maps suggested something else entirely. A detour, a pause, a location that had never been searched because no one thought to look there. The possibility electrified the team. If the victim had been taken out of the city, everything changed. Jurisdictional boundaries, evidence recovery, witness pools. The case widened just as it seemed ready to close. And with that expansion came fear. Fear that the truth might finally surface, and fear that it still might not. In the background, the city watched, remembering just enough to feel uneasy. This was no longer just an old disappearance. It was a mirror held up to the past, reflecting mistakes, blind spots, and the cost of moving on too quickly. The cold case had warmed, but it had not softened. If anything, it had grown sharper, more dangerous, more capable of cutting deep. And as investigators prepared to take the next irreversible step, one realization settled heavily over everyone involved. Identifying a suspect after 35 years was not the end of the mystery. It was the moment the mystery stopped hiding. The decision to move forward felt less like progress and more like crossing a line that could not be uncrossed, because once the investigation stepped beyond theory and into action, there would be no way to retreat into uncertainty again. The detectives knew this. The suspect knew it too. Somewhere beneath the calm exterior he had worn for decades, something had shifted, a subtle tightening that revealed itself not in words but in posture, in the way his eyes tracked questions before answering them, in the way his hands stayed unnaturally still on the table. The renewed focus on his past cracked open a life that had aged quietly, almost invisibly. Friends described him as reliable, predictable, a man who never drew attention. Coworkers said he kept to himself, followed rules, avoided conflict. There were no obvious red flags, no stories of violence, no sudden disappearances attached to his name. That was the problem. The absence of chaos made him harder to read, harder to place inside the frame of a crime that had swallowed someone whole without leaving debris. Investigators began to dig deeper, beyond the years immediately surrounding 1988, searching for behavioral patterns that might explain the silence. What they found was not explosive, but it was persistent. A tendency to control narratives. A habit of minimizing personal connections. Relationships that ended abruptly, without explanation, leaving behind confusion rather than anger. Nothing illegal. Nothing provable. Just a consistent echo of withdrawal whenever things became complicated. The victim's life, by contrast, unfolded like an open book filled with underlined passages no one had paid attention to at the time. Financial stress that had never quite risen to crisis. A growing sense of unease expressed to friends in passing comments that now sounded like warnings. A single remark, buried in an old interview transcript, about feeling watched, about someone knowing too much. At the time, it had been dismissed as anxiety. Now it read like a flare fired into the past. The cold case unit revisited physical locations that had long been written off. The apartment building, altered by renovations but still structurally the same, was scanned again. New technology peeled back layers the original investigators could not see, revealing traces that raised questions without answering them. Something had been moved. Something had been cleaned with intent. Not enough to prove violence, just enough to suggest preparation. The kind of preparation that assumes time will erase what effort cannot. Outside the city, the detour route flagged in the suspect's old timeline became the focus of intense scrutiny. Investigators drove it themselves at night, matching conditions as closely as possible to those recorded decades earlier. The roads stretched long and empty, flanked by industrial land and forgotten clearings. Places where no one lingered. Places that had changed just enough to hide what once might have been visible. They stopped at a point marked only by coordinates and stood in silence, imagining what could have happened there under cover of darkness. No remains were found. No definitive evidence surfaced. But something about the location felt wrong in a way that resisted logic. It was too deliberate, too far from where anyone would casually wander. The kind of place chosen, not stumbled upon. Investigators marked it, documented it, and left with more questions than answers, the weight of possibilities settling heavily in their chests. As pressure increased, the suspect's story began to evolve. Not dramatically, subtly. Small revisions framed as clarifications. Dates adjusted by a day. Times rounded instead of exact. Details once offered freely now accompanied by hesitation. When confronted with earlier statements, he claimed confusion, the natural erosion of memory. It was a reasonable defense. 35 years blurs everything. But the blurring was selective, affecting only the moments that mattered most. The legal battle intensified before any charges were filed. Motions were prepared. Experts were consulted to dismantle the reliability of aged testimony. The defense painted the reopening as an emotional response rather than an evidentiary one, arguing that nostalgia and regret had replaced facts. They reminded the public that suspicion was not guilt, that absence was not proof. In many ways, they were right. And that truth complicated everything. Media coverage grew louder, more aggressive. Each update fueled speculation. Armchair detectives reconstructed timelines online, turning fragments into theories, theories into accusations. The victim's name trended briefly, then lingered in the background, tied forever now to the phrase "cold case reopened." The suspect's life, once anonymous, became a subject of public dissection. His neighbors watched him differently. Strangers recognized him in places where he had always blended in. The past had finally caught up. Inside the investigation, frustration simmered. Detectives felt the clock pressing from both sides, time already stolen and time still slipping away. Witnesses were elderly, memories fragile, opportunities finite. Every lead had to matter. Every move had to count. And yet, the case resisted closure with stubborn insistence, as if the truth itself had learned how to hide. One witness, previously overlooked, returned with a statement that altered the emotional temperature of the case. They described a late-night interaction with the victim shortly before the disappearance, a moment charged with fear that had gone unreported out of self-preservation. They named the suspect without hesitation. The encounter, brief and indirect, suggested urgency, a sense that something was about to happen and could not be stopped. It was not proof, but it was powerful. The statement reignited hope and anxiety in equal measure. If it held up, it strengthened the case. If it collapsed under scrutiny, it could weaken everything. Investigators corroborated what they could, cross-checking details against old records, maps, schedules. Some elements aligned too neatly to ignore. Others remained frustratingly unverifiable. The truth hovered just beyond reach, close enough to feel, distant enough to deny. The family listened to updates with a quiet intensity born of exhaustion. They had lived with uncertainty so long it had become familiar, almost safe in its own cruel way. Now, with answers seemingly within reach, the fear shifted. What if the truth was worse than not knowing? What if justice came too late to matter? What if it never came at all? As the case edged closer to a breaking point, one fact remained unchanged, immutable, and devastating in its simplicity. The victim was still missing. No grave to mourn at. No moment of finality to anchor the story. Just a life interrupted, suspended in a narrative that refused to end. The investigation had exposed cracks in the suspect's story, in the city's memory, in the system itself. But cracks do not always lead to collapse. Sometimes they just let in enough light to show how deep the darkness really goes. And as the detectives prepared for the next step, the one that could either confirm everything or destroy it, the cold case pulsed with renewed tension, alive again, dangerous again, and still holding its most important secret close. The moment the investigation shifted from reconstruction to confrontation, the air around the case changed, thickened, as if the city itself sensed that something buried too long was about to be disturbed. Detectives no longer spoke in hypotheticals. Their language sharpened. Timelines were no longer flexible. They were pinned down, tested, forced to withstand pressure. Every assumption was challenged, every comfortable explanation stripped away. The cold case had reached the stage where it could either fracture under scrutiny or finally reveal what it had been protecting for decades. The suspect was summoned again, this time without the courtesy of ambiguity. The interview room carried none of the neutrality it once had. Photographs were placed on the table, documents slid forward with purpose, questions delivered not as invitations, but as demands. He was shown evidence that contradicted his earlier statements, not enough to corner him legally, but enough to make retreat impossible. His composure held, but it no longer felt natural. It felt practiced. Investigators pressed on the detour, the unexplained drive beyond the city limits, the hours that could not be accounted for without contradiction. The suspect's answers slowed. He blamed fatigue, confusion, the passage of time. When asked why his memory failed only in that narrow window, he offered no clear explanation. Silence filled the gaps, heavy and deliberate. It was the kind of silence that does not deny guilt but does not release it either. Behind the scenes, forensic analysts revisited old items that had once been deemed irrelevant. A piece of fabric recovered from the victim's apartment. Trace material from a vehicle connected to the suspect. In 1988, the technology to extract meaning from these fragments did not exist. Now, each fiber, each microscopic residue, carried the potential to rewrite history. Results came back slowly, methodically, building anticipation with every passing day. Some findings confirmed contact. Others raised uncomfortable possibilities. None delivered certainty. The media sensed escalation and responded accordingly. Reports shifted in tone, no longer speculative, but cautiously accusatory. Phrases like person of interest gave way to identified suspect. Commentators debated whether justice delayed could still be justice at all. The public, hungry for resolution, began to choose sides, some convinced of guilt, others wary of condemning a man based on a case older than many of the people discussing it. Within the victim's community, the reopening reopened wounds. Old friendships were tested as memories clashed. Some insisted they had always suspected something darker. Others admitted they had wanted to believe the disappearance was voluntary, easier than accepting violence. The truth, whatever it was, threatened to expose not just a crime, but a collective failure to look closely enough when it mattered. A search was authorized in a location long ignored, prompted by a convergence of new analysis and old intuition. It was not dramatic. No flashing lights. No crowds. Just a quiet operation conducted with the weight of decades pressing down on every step. Investigators dug carefully, aware that the absence of evidence could be as loud as its discovery. The ground gave up nothing definitive. No remains. No clear markers. But the act of searching itself sent a message. The case was no longer dormant. It was active. It was watching. The suspect responded to the renewed attention by retreating further into silence. Through counsel, he declined additional interviews. Public statements ceased. Friends distanced themselves. His world shrank as the walls closed in, not physically, but psychologically. The anonymity he had enjoyed for so long dissolved, replaced by scrutiny that followed him everywhere, a constant reminder that time had not erased what he thought it had. Investigators faced a familiar and brutal truth. They were close, but not close enough. The evidence suggested involvement. The behavior implied intent. The circumstances aligned with disturbing precision. Yet the standard required to move forward remained just out of reach. Without a body, without a definitive link tying the suspect to a moment of violence, the case hovered in legal limbo, threatening to collapse under its own weight. The family was informed of every development with cautious restraint. Hope was rationed. Promises avoided. They listened, nodded, absorbed information that felt both empowering and cruel. Each new lead offered the possibility of answers and the risk of another dead end. They had learned not to celebrate too early. 35 years had taught them that. As weeks passed, internal debates intensified. Some investigators argued for patience, for building an unassailable case no matter how long it took. Others feared time would steal what little remained, that witnesses would fade, evidence would degrade, and momentum would be lost once again. The pressure to act collided with the fear of failure, creating a tension that mirrored the case itself. And beneath it all, the central mystery remained untouched. What happened in the final moments before the victim vanished? Was it sudden or planned? Violent or coercive? An act of desperation or calculation? The answers, locked somewhere between memory and reality, refused to surface. The cold case, once silent, now pulsed with unanswered questions, louder than ever, daring the investigation to prove that some truths, no matter how long they hide, can still be forced into the light. By the time the investigation reached its fifth decade-adjacent year, the case no longer felt like a search for answers so much as a negotiation with absence itself, a constant attempt to define the shape of something that refused to be seen. Detectives worked under the understanding that whatever happened in 1988 had been carefully designed to leave as little behind as possible, and that every remaining trace would be fragile, contested, and incomplete. The cold case had become an exercise in restraint, knowing when to push and when to wait, when to speak and when to let silence do the work. The suspect's silence grew louder with each passing day. Through his attorney, he declined cooperation, citing memory loss and the unfairness of being targeted so long after the fact. The strategy was effective. Without new statements to challenge, investigators were forced to rely entirely on reconstruction, on stitching together moments from the past with tools never meant to replace first-hand truth. Every inference carried risk. Every conclusion invited challenge. Attention turned inward, back to the victim's final weeks, searching for behavioral shifts that might explain what followed. Friends recalled subtle changes, a guardedness that hadn't been there before, a tendency to check surroundings, to avoid certain places without explanation. At the time, these details had seemed trivial. Now they suggested awareness, perhaps fear, perhaps pressure applied quietly, methodically. Someone had been in the victim's orbit, influencing decisions, narrowing options. Financial records were re-examined, not for theft, but for leverage. Small, unexplained transactions. A pattern of withdrawals that did not align with routine spending. Nothing illegal, nothing dramatic, but enough to raise the possibility of dependency, of obligations that could be exploited. Investigators considered scenarios where compliance was extracted without violence, where disappearance was not an explosion, but a slow compression. The apartment remained a focal point, its ordinary stillness a constant provocation. Analysts revisited the layout, the entry points, the neighbors' lines of sight. They tested how sound traveled through the building, how easily an argument could be masked by traffic, by radios, by the hum of the city itself. The conclusion was unsettling. Almost anything could have happened without anyone noticing enough to intervene. Media narratives shifted again, this time emphasizing the absence of remains, framing the case as a puzzle that might never be solved definitively. Public patience thinned. Some accused investigators of chasing ghosts. Others demanded action, arrests, closure. The cold case sat at the center of the debate, a reminder that truth does not operate on deadlines, and justice does not always arrive in clean, satisfying forms. One lead, long considered too speculative, resurfaced with renewed relevance. A report of a vehicle seen idling near the apartment on the night of the disappearance, engine running longer than necessary, lights off. The description matched the suspect's vehicle model at the time. In 1988, it had meant little. In the context of everything else, it felt deliberate. Investigators tracked down the witness, now elderly, their memory fragile but emotionally certain. They could not swear to a face. They could swear to the feeling that something was wrong. Corroboration followed in fragments. Traffic patterns, old maintenance logs, a parking violation recorded blocks away at an odd hour. None of it proved anything on its own. Together, it suggested presence, opportunity, a convergence of choices that pointed toward intent rather than accident. The case tightened, not enough to snap, but enough to strain. The legal team prepared for the possibility of escalation. They knew any move would be scrutinized, challenged, dissected. They also knew that waiting carried its own risk. Cold cases have a way of slipping back into dormancy when momentum fades. The balance between caution and courage grew thinner by the day. For the family, time took on a different shape. Each update arrived heavy with implication. Each pause felt like regression. They spoke less about outcomes and more about memory, about who the victim had been before becoming a headline, before becoming a question mark. They wanted that person remembered, regardless of what the investigation produced. Justice, to them, was not only about accountability, it was about recognition. Behind closed doors, investigators debated the unthinkable possibility that the case might move forward without the certainty everyone wanted, that the truth, fractured and incomplete, might still be enough. That absence could be argued as evidence, silence as intention. It was a risky path, one that demanded confidence in inference and faith in a system often uncomfortable with ambiguity. As winter settled in, the city returned to its routines, but the cold case refused to cool. It lingered in news cycles, in conversations, in the quiet calculations of those tasked with carrying it to the end. The mystery remained unresolved, but it was no longer static. It was alive, shifting, resisting closure while inching closer to it. And somewhere beneath all the analysis, all the speculation, all the carefully constructed theories, one truth remained undeniable. Whatever happened in 1988 was not random. It was shaped by choices, by proximity, by silence. The only question left was whether those choices would ever be fully exposed, or whether the cold case would claim one final victory by keeping its most devastating secret forever out of reach. By the time spring arrived, the investigation had reached a point where every new detail felt less like discovery and more like excavation, digging through layers of intention rather than soil, uncovering not artifacts, but decisions made in the dark. The cold case no longer asked what happened in a general sense. It asked how and why, and whether the truth had been hiding in plain sight all along, protected not by brilliance but by patience. Detectives revisited the suspect's life in the years immediately following the disappearance, searching for disruption. Trauma leaves marks, even when carefully concealed. They examined employment records, relocations, shifts in social behavior. What emerged was not collapse, but consolidation. The suspect had simplified his world. Fewer close relationships, a tighter routine, a life designed to minimize unpredictability. To some, it looked like maturity. To investigators, it looked like containment. There was a move, subtle but significant, less than a year after 1988. Not far, not dramatic, just far enough to create distance from familiar streets, from memories that might surface at the wrong moment. At the time, it raised no alarms. People move all the time. Now it read like a boundary drawn after the fact, a way to close a chapter without acknowledging it. The victim's absence continued to distort time. Birthdays passed unmarked. Holidays became quieter. Friends grew older without shared reference points, memories splitting into before and after without a clear dividing line. Investigators spoke to those friends again, listening for emotional cues as much as factual ones. Grief had softened into something more complex, resignation mixed with lingering guilt. Many admitted they had sensed something was wrong back then, but had chosen not to press. Life was busy. The city was loud. Disappearances, sadly, were not unheard of. One interview, however, cut through the emotional fog. A former acquaintance of the suspect described a conversation from the early 1990s, casual on the surface, unsettling beneath. A comment about how people underestimate how easy it is to make someone disappear in a city that never stops moving. At the time, it had been dismissed as dark humor. Now it landed differently. The witness could not recall the exact wording. They remembered the tone. Confident. Knowing. As if the idea was not theoretical. Investigators documented it carefully, aware of its fragility. Memory is malleable, especially after decades. Still, the statement added texture to a portrait already taking shape. This was not a crime of impulse. It was a crime of calculation, or at least of opportunity recognized and exploited. The absence of physical remains continued to frustrate every angle of the case. Searches expanded beyond the original detour route, guided by updated models of disposal, by changes in landscape over time. Landfills had been capped. Construction had reshaped entire neighborhoods. Waterways had carried sediment far from their origins. The city had eaten its own past. Each search concluded the same way, nothing definitive, only the confirmation that if evidence ever existed in those places, it was now beyond recovery. Pressure from above mounted. Cold cases are expensive, resource-heavy, and politically risky. Questions were asked about priorities, about outcomes, about whether the pursuit had become symbolic rather than practical. Detectives pushed back, arguing that symbols matter, that unresolved violence corrodes trust quietly but persistently. The debate mirrored the case itself, visible uncertainty versus invisible consequence. The suspect's legal team sensed the shift and responded aggressively. They challenged the admissibility of reinterpreted evidence, the credibility of aged witnesses, the ethics of applying modern analysis to decades-old material. Their strategy was not to prove innocence, but to amplify doubt. And doubt, in this case, was abundant. Meanwhile, the suspect lived in a state of controlled exposure. He was not charged. He was not free. Every public appearance carried weight. Every silence invited speculation. Friends avoided him. Neighbors watched him. The anonymity that had once protected him was gone, replaced by a reputation built entirely on implication. It was a punishment without verdict, and it hardened him. Those who observed him closely noted a shift, a defensiveness that bordered on hostility, a resentment toward a system he believed had no right to reach back so far. Investigators wondered whether that resentment might crack. Pressure can produce mistakes. It can loosen tongues. They monitored communications where legally possible, watched for changes in behavior, waited for the moment when control slipped. It did not come easily. If guilt existed, it was deeply buried beneath routine and denial. The case reached a psychological impasse. Everyone involved felt it. Too much suggested wrongdoing. Too little could prove it. The cold case existed in that narrow, unbearable space where truth feels close enough to touch, but impossible to grasp. It demanded faith from those pursuing it, and patience from those living with its consequences. As summer approached, one final lead emerged, quiet but persistent, drawn from a convergence of minor details rather than a single revelation. A place not previously connected, a routine overlooked because it seemed too ordinary. Investigators followed it carefully, aware that this might be the last viable thread. If it held, the case could move forward. If it broke, the cold case might settle back into silence, unresolved once more. And beneath the procedural tension, beneath the legal maneuvering and public debate, the emotional truth remained unchanged. A person vanished, a life was interrupted, and the city absorbed the loss without ever fully acknowledging it. Whether justice would finally surface or not, the cold case had already left its mark, a reminder that some crimes do not end when they happen, but continue unfolding for decades, shaping lives through the very absence of answers. The new lead did not announce itself with drama or urgency. It arrived quietly, almost apologetically, the way truth sometimes does when it has been waiting too long to be believed. It emerged from a routine cross-check, a pattern so mundane it had been overlooked for decades because it blended too well with everyday life. A place visited regularly. A habit repeated without variation. The kind of consistency that feels harmless until it suddenly doesn't. Investigators focused on a location the suspect had frequented both before and after the disappearance, a place that had survived the city's transformations largely unchanged. Not a remote clearing or an industrial wasteland, but something far more unsettling in its ordinariness. A space people passed every day without looking twice. A place where presence would never raise suspicion. The realization sent a quiet chill through the team. If the crime had been hidden there, it had been protected by normalcy itself. They mapped the suspect's routine against the victim's final movements and found an overlap too precise to ignore. A narrow window of time. A shared proximity that could not be explained by coincidence alone. In 1988, it would have been dismissed as circumstantial. In the context of everything else, it felt deliberate. Investigators returned to the site repeatedly, studying how it looked at night, how sound traveled, how easily someone could enter and leave without drawing attention. Again, there were no remains. No obvious physical traces. Time had done its work too well. But something about the place aligned with the psychological profile that had been forming over months of analysis. Control. Privacy disguised as openness. The ability to manage risk through familiarity. This was not a location chosen in panic. It was chosen because it was known. Witnesses connected to the area were interviewed, their recollections fragmented, but emotionally charged. One remembered seeing the suspect there late on the night in question, at an hour that did not match his claimed schedule. Another recalled a vehicle parked awkwardly, as if hastily positioned. None could provide definitive identification. All expressed the same uneasy certainty that the memory mattered, even if it could not be fully trusted. The case reached a point where evidence and intuition began to blur. Detectives were careful not to cross that line publicly, but privately they acknowledged it. Cold cases rarely offer clean resolutions. They offer convergence. Enough alignment to suggest truth, even when absolute proof remains elusive. The challenge was translating that convergence into something the system could accept. The legal strategy shifted in response. Prosecutors were consulted, hypotheticals tested. Could a case be built on cumulative inference? On behavioral patterns supported by circumstantial evidence? On absence itself, framed as the result of intentional erasure? The answers were cautious, conditional, filled with warnings. It could be done. It could also fail spectacularly. The suspect felt the shift before it was announced. Pressure intensified. Surveillance increased. Subtle changes in his behavior suggested awareness, not panic, but calculation. He avoided the location now under scrutiny. Adjusted routines. Limited contact. These changes, while not incriminating on their own, fit too neatly into the narrative investigators were building. The past was shaping the present in ways that could not be fully controlled. Public reaction oscillated between anticipation and fatigue. Some demanded an arrest, convinced the mystery had stretched long enough. Others warned against forcing closure where certainty did not exist. The cold case had become a litmus test for faith in the justice system itself. Could it reach back across decades and still get it right? Or would it only expose its own limitations? The family watched from a distance, emotionally guarded. They had learned to recognize false momentum, the rise and fall of hope that left deeper scars each time. Still, something about this phase felt different. The questions were sharper, the focus narrower. The investigation no longer felt like it was searching everywhere, at once. It felt like it was circling. One final interview was conducted with a witness whose silence had been absolute for decades. Fear, they said, had kept them quiet. Fear of retaliation. Fear of being wrong. Fear of being pulled into something they could not escape. Time had softened that fear just enough to speak. Their account did not offer new facts. It offered context. A sense of threat that had hovered around the victim in the days before the disappearance. A name spoken carefully, almost reluctantly. The suspects. It was not the revelation investigators had hoped for. It was something quieter, more haunting. Confirmation that the danger had been felt, even if it had never been reported. That the victim had not vanished into randomness, but into a situation charged with intent. As the investigation narrowed its focus to a single path, the stakes rose accordingly. There would be no easy retreat now. Either the case would move forward, risking exposure and failure, or it would stall again, this time under the weight of everything already uncovered. The cold case stood at the edge of transformation, no longer dormant, not yet resolved, balanced between justice and uncertainty, waiting to see which would claim it. Momentum is a dangerous thing in a case like this. It can sharpen focus or distort it, clarify judgment or rush it. By the time Part 8 began to take shape, the investigation was moving not because of optimism, but because stopping now felt more reckless than continuing. Too many threads converged. Too many decisions from 1988 aligned with a logic that no longer looked accidental. The cold case had reached the phase where every step forward risked collapse, yet standing still guaranteed it. The location that had emerged as central to the suspect's routine became the quiet axis of the investigation. Not sealed off, not dramatic, just watched, day after day, night after night. Detectives observed how people moved through it, how anonymity functioned there, how easily presence dissolved into background noise. What disturbed them most was not what they saw, but how unremarkable it all was. This was a place built to erase memory through repetition. If something terrible had happened here, it would have been swallowed instantly. Reconstruction teams worked backward, layering historical data over modern observation. Old photographs, archived maintenance schedules, property records. In 1988, the space had been even less visible, less monitored, less defined. Blind spots had existed where none remain now. Investigators traced those blind spots carefully, imagining the movements of someone who knew exactly where not to be seen. The suspect's history with the location deepened under scrutiny. He had not just visited it. He had relied on it, used it as a fixed point in his life, a stabilizer. That reliance was documented in mundane ways: receipts, witness recollections, scheduling habits. It suggested familiarity so complete it bordered on ownership, even without legal claim. This was not opportunism. This was comfort. Pressure from prosecutors intensified. They wanted something solid, something that could survive a courtroom built to dismantle narratives piece by piece. Circumstantial evidence was acceptable, but only if it formed a closed loop. Every gap needed explanation. Every assumption needed support. The absence of a body remained the central obstacle, looming over every conversation like an accusation. Investigators debated a move they had avoided for months: direct confrontation using the full narrative they had assembled. Not an interview, a presentation. Lay out the timeline, the overlaps, the inconsistencies. Force the suspect to see the shape of the case as it now existed. The risk was obvious. He could retreat further into silence. He could lawyer up completely. Or worse, he could adapt. The meeting was approved. It took place in a controlled environment, neutral, procedural, stripped of theatrics. The suspect listened as detectives walked him through a version of his own life he had never heard spoken aloud in sequence. The drive, the detour, the location, the witness statements, the behavioral shifts. They did not accuse him directly. They didn't have to. The implication hung in the air, undeniable. For the first time, something broke through the composure. Not a confession. Not anger. Fatigue. His posture sagged slightly. His eyes lingered too long on certain photographs. He corrected one minor detail instinctively, then stopped himself. The moment passed quickly, but everyone in the room felt it. This was the closest they had come to the truth, making contact. Afterward, his silence hardened into something colder. Communication ceased entirely. No responses. No engagement. The legal wall went up, higher than before. To investigators, it felt like confirmation without proof. To prosecutors, it felt like a problem. The media learned of the confrontation through leaks, and the reaction was immediate. Headlines sharpened. Commentary turned aggressive. Some outlets spoke openly about an impending arrest. Others warned of another collapse, another promise broken. The cold case was no longer just a mystery. It was a public reckoning. The family received the update with a complicated stillness. They had imagined this moment for years, rehearsed it in private conversations, in sleepless nights. Now that it was real, it felt strangely hollow. Without a confession, without remains, without finality. They were closer than ever and still suspended in uncertainty. Behind the scenes, a new internal fracture emerged. Investigators disagreed about intent. Some believed the disappearance had escalated unexpectedly, that control had slipped and panic had followed. Others argued for premeditation, for a plan designed to leave nothing behind. The distinction mattered legally and morally. Accident implied opportunity. Planning implied certainty. A breakthrough threatened to settle the debate. An analyst revisiting old, dismissed data noticed an inconsistency in disposal timing related to the suspect's routine. A narrow window where he had claimed to be alone, unaccounted for, engaged in an activity that left no record. The timing aligned with the last confirmed trace of the victim. It wasn't new information. It was recontextualized information, and it changed the math. Search authorization was expanded again, this time focused not on where remains might be found, but on where evidence of removal might have existed and since vanished. The search was forensic in philosophy rather than expectation-driven. They weren't looking for a body. They were looking for signs of erasure. What they found was subtle. A disturbance pattern inconsistent with natural decay. Soil composition altered in a way that suggested past intervention. Not enough to declare a burial. Enough to suggest something had been there, briefly, and then taken away. It was the closest the case had come to physical confirmation. Experts cautioned restraint. The findings could be explained innocently. They could also fit perfectly into the emerging narrative. Once again, certainty hovered just beyond reach. As summer edged toward fall, the investigation faced its defining question. Was this enough to move forward, knowing the risk of failure, knowing the damage another collapse would cause? Or was it better to wait, to hope time would yield one final gift, one unambiguous truth? The cold case, reopened and exposed, seemed to hold its breath. And somewhere in that suspended moment, the reality became unavoidable. Even if justice came, it would not restore what was lost. It would only name what happened in the silence. The city would absorb the verdict the way it absorbed the disappearance, quietly, imperfectly, forever marked by what it took so long to face. The moment the question of action eclipsed the question of truth, the investigation entered its most dangerous phase, because moving forward now meant committing to a version of events that could never be fully proven, only powerfully argued. The cold case had become a test not just of evidence, but of nerve. Every person involved understood the stakes. If they advanced and failed, the case might never recover. If they hesitated and lost momentum, it might fade forever. Meetings stretched late into the night. Conference rooms filled with timelines taped to walls, photographs connected by red lines, dates circled and recircled until they blurred. Prosecutors demanded clarity. Investigators offered convergence. Analysts spoke in probabilities and likelihoods rather than absolutes. No one pretended this was clean. They were no longer searching for certainty. They were deciding whether the weight of inference was enough to bear the load of justice. The suspect remained silent, but his silence had changed texture. It no longer felt defensive. It felt final. He had chosen his position and fortified it, retreating into a legal structure designed to withstand pressure indefinitely. There would be no spontaneous confession, no emotional collapse. If the truth was going to surface, it would have to be extracted through process, not persuasion. Public attention intensified again as rumors leaked that charges were being considered. The phrase cold case breakthrough appeared beside more cautious language like pending review and under evaluation. The tension between hope and skepticism sharpened. Some saw the delay as cowardice. Others saw it as responsibility. The city, accustomed to unresolved violence, waited with a mixture of impatience and dread. The family felt the strain in ways that were less visible but more profound. They had reached the point where imagining an outcome was harder than enduring uncertainty. A verdict, any verdict, would freeze the narrative. It would define the disappearance in permanent terms. And permanence, after decades of fluid pain, was terrifying. Behind closed doors, one decision tipped the balance. A prosecutor, known for caution, acknowledged what everyone had been avoiding. That absence, when shaped by consistent, intentional behavior, could itself be evidence. That erasure could speak. That the lack of a body did not negate the presence of a crime if the story of removal was coherent and supported. It was not confidence. It was acceptance of risk. Preparations began quietly, not with announcements, but with paperwork. Warrants drafted and revised. Arguments stress-tested against imagined cross-examinations. Every weakness identified and reinforced where possible. The case was being transformed from an investigation into a narrative, one that would have to survive scrutiny designed to tear it apart. Then, unexpectedly, the past offered one more fragment. A box, misfiled decades earlier, surfaced during a routine audit. Inside it, among irrelevant documents, was a report that had never been fully explored. A transit-related record. Mundane. Overlooked. It documented a brief anomaly on the night of the disappearance, a delay, a stop that did not align with standard operation. At the time, it had been dismissed as mechanical. Now, paired with the suspect's unaccounted window, it felt intentional. Analysts pored over it. Experts debated interpretations. Could it be coincidence? Yes. Could it align with movement, with transfer, with concealment? Also yes. It did not solve the case. It tightened it. Another small weight added to a scale already leaning heavily in one direction. The suspect was informed indirectly that the case was advancing. His response was muted, but not neutral. Through counsel, he issued a statement asserting innocence and condemning the reopening as speculative and cruel. It was the first time he had spoken publicly in years. The words were measured, the tone restrained, but beneath it ran a current of anger that had not been there before. Investigators noted the shift. Emotional leakage, they called it, not proof. But pressure often reveals where defenses are weakest. As the timeline moved toward a formal decision, doubt returned in waves. What if they were wrong? What if the story they had built was elegant but false? Cold cases are fertile ground for confirmation bias, for patterns imposed rather than discovered. Everyone involved wrestled with that fear. The difference now was that fear no longer paralyzed action. It sharpened it. The city held its breath as whispers of an impending arrest spread. Some braced for disappointment. Others prepared for vindication. The cold case, once a footnote, now stood at the center of a reckoning decades overdue. And yet, beneath the legal machinery grinding toward resolution, the fundamental truth remained unchanged. Whatever decision was made would not restore the lost years. It would not answer every question. It would not quiet every doubt. It would simply assert, publicly and irrevocably, that what happened in 1988 mattered enough to name. As the final documents were prepared and the last arguments rehearsed, one realization cut through everything else with brutal clarity. The cold case had already reshaped everyone it touched. The only thing left to decide was whether the system would accept that transformation or retreat once more into the safety of unresolved silence. The night before the decision was made, no one slept well. Not the investigators who had lived inside the case for months, sometimes years. Not the prosecutors who would have to stand behind every word they put on paper. Not the family who sensed that something irreversible was finally approaching. The cold case had narrowed to a single moment, a hinge in time where hesitation would turn into history. At dawn, the city moved as it always did. Trains ran late. Coffee steamed from sidewalk carts. Sirens echoed and faded. Nothing on the surface suggested that a story buried since 1988 was about to resurface with force. Inside a quiet office, signatures were added to documents that carried decades of weight. The decision was not framed as certainty. It was framed as responsibility. The warrant was approved. Not for closure. Not for comfort. For accountability. The suspect was taken into custody without spectacle. No flashing lights. No crowd control. Just a knock, a brief exchange, and the reality he had avoided for 35 years finally stepping into the room with him. He did not resist.
He did not speak.
As he was escorted away, neighbors watched from behind curtains, trying to reconcile the ordinary man they thought they knew with the name now tied to a cold case that had haunted the city for a generation. News broke within minutes. Headlines moved faster than facts, compressing decades into a single sentence. Cold case arrest. 1988 disappearance. Suspect identified after 35 years. The public reaction was immediate and divided. Some felt relief, a sense that justice, however late, had finally arrived. Others felt unease, wary of celebrating before truth had been tested. The cold case was no longer theoretical. It was alive, contested, and headed for a courtroom. Inside the interrogation room, the atmosphere was different this time. The suspect was no longer protected by ambiguity. He was no longer just a person of interest. He was a defendant. Detectives presented the narrative they had spent months refining, not as accusation, but as fact supported by convergence. The timeline, the overlaps, the inconsistencies, the erasure. They spoke calmly, deliberately, aware that every word now carried legal consequence. He listened without interruption. When he finally spoke, it was not to confess.
It was to deny.
Again. But the denial was stripped of its earlier confidence. It leaned heavily on technicalities, on the absence of a body, on the erosion of memory. He framed himself as a victim of circumstance, of a system desperate to resolve its own failures. It was a practiced argument. It was also thin. The prosecution prepared for a case that would never be simple. There would be no dramatic forensic reveal. No final photograph. No recovered remains. The story would be built from structure, not spectacle. From behavior rather than blood. From what was done, and what was deliberately undone. They knew the defense would attack every gap, every inference, every witness aged by time. The trial would be as much about belief as evidence. The family watched the arrest footage in silence. There were no cheers, no tears, just a heavy stillness that settled over the room. For the first time in decades, the story had moved forward without them having to push it. Whether that movement led to justice or disappointment no longer mattered as much as the fact that the silence had finally been broken. In the days that followed, the suspect's past was dissected publicly. Old acquaintances came forward. Some defended him fiercely. Others admitted they had always felt something was wrong, but never imagined it could lead here. The city engaged in the familiar ritual of retroactive recognition, searching memories for signs that had never been obvious enough to act on. Legal motions flew back and forth. Evidence was challenged. Timelines contested. The absence of remains loomed over every argument like a shadow that could not be dispelled. And yet, something had changed irreversibly. The cold case was no longer a question. It was a charge. As the court date approached, investigators felt an unfamiliar emotion creep in alongside exhaustion, detachment. Their role in the story was ending. Soon, the narrative would belong to lawyers, judges, and jurors. The truth, whatever shape it took, would be filtered through procedure and precedent. The raw mystery that had driven them for so long would be translated into verdict language. The city waited again, but this time the waiting felt different. Not passive. Not forgotten. The cold case had forced itself back into collective consciousness, reminding everyone that time does not neutralize harm, it only disguises it. Whether the outcome would satisfy anyone remained uncertain. And beneath the legal process unfolding with careful precision, one final, haunting question remained unanswered, hanging over everything like a held breath. If the system was finally ready to speak, would the truth speak back? Or would the silence that began in 1988 claim one last victory before the story reached its end? The courtroom never filled with the answers people expected. It filled with tension instead, thick and unmoving, the kind that presses against the chest and refuses to let go. Wood benches creaked under shifting weight. Fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead. The case that had once lived in whispers and rumor now existed inside sworn testimony, but the mystery that began in 1988 refused to shrink under oath. The prosecution spoke of patterns, of absence as evidence, of how a person can erase another life not only by violence, but by planning, by patience, by understanding exactly how systems fail when time is stretched thin. They reconstructed a story without theatrics, brick by brick, asking the jury to see what had been hidden in plain sight for decades. Not a single moment, but a sequence. Not rage, but control. The defense answered with doubt. Reasonable doubt. They reminded the room that there was no body, no weapon, no final scene frozen in time. They spoke of memory decay, of investigative bias, of a city desperate to close a cold case and willing to bend interpretation to do it. They asked the jury to imagine 35 years of normal life as proof of innocence, to see the suspect not as a man who got away with something, but as a man finally crushed by history's impatience. Witnesses came and went. Voices trembled. Some stories blurred at the edges. Others cut sharply, unexpectedly precise. Each testimony added weight, but not clarity, like layers of fog settling over a streetlight. The jury listened, took notes, exchanged glances that revealed nothing. Outside the courtroom, the city speculated endlessly, replaying headlines, arguing in comment sections, treating uncertainty like entertainment. For the family, every day inside that room was a reopening of wounds that never healed. They watched strangers debate the worth of a life that had shaped their own. They listened as timelines were questioned, as intentions were dissected, as the disappearance that defined them was reduced to exhibits and phrasing. Closure was no longer a promise. It was a word people used carefully, afraid to say it too loudly. When closing arguments ended, the silence felt louder than anything that had come before. The jury was sent away. The room exhaled. Days passed. Nights stretched long. Every knock, every phone vibration carried the weight of finality. The cold case, once frozen by neglect, now burned with the threat of resolution or collapse. The verdict, when it came, did not deliver certainty. It delivered division. Some charges held. Others did not. Legal language sliced the story into pieces that no longer resembled the whole. The suspect was neither fully condemned nor fully absolved. He was sentenced, but not for everything people believed he had done. The court acknowledged responsibility without naming the deepest truth. The law closed its file. The mystery remained. Outside, microphones clustered. Statements were read. Faces hardened for cameras. The words justice and disappointment were used interchangeably, depending on who was speaking. The city tried to decide how to feel, but the feeling refused to settle. A cold case reopened had not become a cold case solved. It had become something else entirely, a fracture. Years of silence had ended, but not in revelation. They ended in ambiguity sharpened by age. The kind that lingers. The kind that replays at night. The suspect was taken away, older now, slower, carrying with him the unresolved gravity of a story that would follow his name long after legal proceedings faded from public attention. Whether he knew more than he ever admitted would remain speculation. Whether the truth had been buried deeper than evidence could reach was a question no verdict could answer. Investigators returned to their lives, changed by the case in ways they would struggle to explain. Some felt pride for pushing the story back into the light. Others felt frustration, haunted by the sense that they had stood inches from something vast and unknowable. Cold cases teach a particular kind of lesson, that truth does not always surface cleanly, and justice does not always arrive whole. The neighborhood where it all began moved on again. New families, new routines, sidewalks repaved, old buildings replaced. But memory does not follow zoning laws. People still lower their voices when the case is mentioned, still glance at certain doorways, still feel a chill when they realize how easily a person can vanish without explanation. The name of the victim is spoken more often now than it was for years. That alone feels like a victory to some. To others, it is a reminder of what was never returned. A life interrupted, a future erased, a presence reduced to a file that never truly closed. Cold cases are not defined by age alone. They are defined by what they leave behind. Unanswered questions, fractured timelines, the uncomfortable truth that time does not guarantee resolution. It only tests how long a community can live with not knowing. In New York, the year 1988 no longer feels as distant as it once did. The past reached forward and touched the present, and in doing so, proved something unsettling. That even after 35 years, even after arrests and trials and headlines, some mysteries resist conclusion. And as the city settles back into its rhythm, as the courtroom lights dim and the cameras move on, one thing remains painfully clear. The cold case may be legally finished, but the story is not. It lives on in the spaces between facts, in the silence where answers should be, and in the shared understanding that somewhere, beneath layers of time and denial, the full truth is still waiting to be found. Years pass quietly after the cameras leave. That is how unresolved stories survive, by blending back into routine, by letting the city's noise cover the echoes. The courthouse returns to its schedule. Files are boxed, labeled, shelved. The case number still exists, but it is no longer called aloud. In offices across the city, new investigations take priority, their urgency fed by fresh blood, fresh clocks. The cold case slips into a different kind of silence, not forgotten, just unfinished. The family learns what this new silence feels like. It is not the hollow absence of the early years, when every phone call might have meant something. It is heavier, more complicated, the kind that comes after hope has been handled, examined, and returned with conditions. They're told the law has done what it can. They nod. They thank people. They go home and sit with the knowledge that truth and legality are not the same thing. In the neighborhood, memory sharpens in unexpected ways. A corner store closes and reopens under a new name, but longtime residents still refer to it by the old one, the way they still refer to the year 1988 as if it were yesterday. People remember where they were when the news first broke. They remember the arrest announcement. They remember thinking, finally. They also remember the verdict, the way it landed unevenly, leaving more questions than answers. Time does not smooth these memories. It organizes them, files them away in the mind where they can be reopened without warning. Late at night, investigators replay moments they never put on the record. A pause in an interview, a look held half a second too long, a lead that arrived too late to be useful. Cold cases leave behind a residue, a fine dust of maybe that settles into thought. They wonder if the truth slipped past them in the margins, disguised as something ordinary. They wonder if the system, built to measure certainty, was never designed to capture this kind of story. The suspect lives inside a narrower world now. Routine replaces freedom. Days are marked by schedules imposed rather than chosen. He speaks rarely about the case. When he does, his words are careful, polished by repetition. He insists history misread him, that he was convenient. That ambiguity became accusation. Whether this is belief or defense no longer matters. What matters is that his name will never separate from the cold case again. Even without a final answer, the story has claimed him. Public interest fades unevenly. Podcasts revisit the details. Articles resurface on anniversaries. Online forums argue endlessly, reconstructing timelines with obsessive precision. Amateur investigators analyze transcripts, convinced the truth is hiding in plain sight. Some believe the case is solved in everything but name. Others believe the wrong man paid the price for collective frustration. The cold case becomes a mirror, reflecting whatever certainty the viewer brings with them. What remains unchanged is the missing piece, the absence that started everything. No location, no remains, no final confirmation, just the echo of a life that should have continued but didn't. The city carries that absence like a quiet scar, mostly invisible, occasionally aching. It surfaces when someone mentions the year, when a familiar street looks different in winter light, when the past presses close enough to be felt. Cold cases teach restraint. They teach the uncomfortable discipline of living without resolution. They remind communities that not every story bends toward a clean ending, that some truths resist exposure no matter how bright the light. The reopening promised answers. It delivered movement. It delivered accountability in fragments. It did not deliver certainty. And still, the case is not entirely still. Somewhere, a box remains unsealed. A note remains unread. A memory remains unspoken. The possibility lingers not as hope, but as persistence. Because unresolved stories do not end when the law stops speaking. They end only when the truth is fully heard. Until then, the cold case breathes quietly beneath the city's noise, waiting, not for attention, but for the one thing it has been denied since 1988. An answer. There is a moment, years later, when the case resurfaces without warning. Not through a headline or a court filing, but through a phone call that arrives after midnight, the kind that makes silence feel dangerous. A retired detective, voice roughened by age, speaks carefully, as if afraid the words might disappear once spoken. He mentions a detail that never made it into evidence. Something small. Something dismissed at the time because it didn't fit the shape investigators were trying to force the story into. A receipt. A handwritten note. A route that makes no sense unless you imagine a different ending. The information moves slowly, passed hand to hand with caution. There is no task force this time, no budget, no press release. Just a few people who still feel responsible to the unanswered. They meet in borrowed offices, compare faded copies, trace old maps with fingers that tremble not from fear, but from recognition. The cold case shifts again, not forward, not backward, but sideways, into territory no one fully explored. The city does not notice. It rarely does. Life continues at speed, indifferent to quiet recalculations happening behind closed doors. But beneath the surface, the story rearranges itself. Motive looks different. Opportunity narrows. A familiar assumption cracks. The absence that once felt fixed begins to feel directional, as if it points somewhere instead of nowhere. The family is told cautiously. No promises. No declarations. Just the truth, delivered gently. There may be more. They receive it without celebration. Experience has taught them that hope, when mishandled, can wound as deeply as loss. Still, something changes in their posture. A tension releases. Not because they expect answers, but because the case has not stopped breathing. Across the city, the name attached to the conviction remains unchanged, locked into records and memory alike. But now it shares space with another possibility, one that complicates rather than replaces. The law may never reopen the file. Statutes and finality resist revision. Yet truth does not answer to procedure. It lingers wherever doubt survives. Online, the arguments grow sharper. New theories compete with old certainties. People redraw timelines, reevaluate witnesses, reinterpret silence. The cold case becomes unstable again, no longer settled enough to ignore, not active enough to resolve. It exists in a narrow corridor between belief and disbelief, where every step forward feels provisional. Late at night, one of the original investigators revisits the scene alone. The building is different now, renovated, repurposed. But the geometry remains. Distances still matter. Sightlines still align. He stands where he once stood decades ago and understands something he didn't then. Not a revelation. A correction. The kind that arrives only when time has stripped urgency away and left clarity behind. He writes it down. Not as proof. As record. The cold case does not end here. It doesn't conclude with revelation or confession or recovered remains. It continues in fragments, in late-night conversations, in boxes reopened and closed again. It continues because unanswered questions do not obey endings. They persist, quietly insisting that the story is larger than any verdict. In New York, the past has a way of resurfacing when least expected.
A sound.
A street. A name spoken aloud after years of avoidance. The year 1988 still echoes, not as history, but as unfinished business. And somewhere between what was proven and what was merely believed, the truth waits, patient and unmoved by time, knowing that even if it is never fully seen, it has already changed everyone who came close enough to feel its weight. Time does not announce itself when it changes a case. It drifts in quietly, reshaping meaning without permission. What once felt settled begins to feel provisional again. The cold case, long believed to have reached its legal end, slips back into conversation, not loudly, not publicly, but persistently, like a low-frequency hum only certain people can hear. Documents resurface. Not new evidence, but old material viewed through a different lens. A transit log dismissed as routine. A call record marked insignificant because it led nowhere obvious. Now, placed beside the late-night revelation, these fragments begin to align. Not into a clean picture, but into a pattern that refuses to be ignored. The story that once pointed in a single direction starts to bend. Those still paying attention feel it immediately. A subtle shift. The sense that something fundamental was misunderstood, not out of malice, but out of urgency. Back then, the pressure was to act, to explain, to reassure a shaken city. Now, with a distance of decades, the same facts breathe differently. They suggest restraint where certainty once lived. The family listens again. They have learned to listen without leaning forward, without bracing for disappointment. They understand now that truth does not always arrive as an answer. Sometimes it arrives as a question sharpened enough to cut through denial. They do not ask for reopening. They ask only for honesty, for acknowledgement that the story may not be as complete as it was declared. No official announcement follows. There is no mechanism for that anymore. The system has moved on. But systems are not the final arbiters of memory.
People are.
And memory, once unsettled, has a way of spreading. Quietly at first, then with insistence. A journalist, new to the profession, stumbles across the case while researching something else. She notices the inconsistencies others learn to live with. She notices what was emphasized and what was barely mentioned. She begins asking questions no one is required to answer. Some doors close. Others open just enough to reveal discomfort. She senses it, the tension between what is recorded and what is believed. The cold case enters a new phase. Not investigation. Reconsideration. Online, the tone shifts. Certainty erodes. Long-held assumptions are challenged not with accusations, but with logic. The narrative fractures into competing interpretations, each backed by selective clarity. The case no longer belongs to one conclusion. It exists in parallel versions, none of them fully satisfying, all of them plausible. The convicted man remains where he is, removed from the noise. He hears fragments of it through intermediaries. He reacts not with fear, but with something closer to vindication. He has always claimed the story was incomplete. Now incompleteness is no longer dismissed as inconvenience. It is becoming the story itself. But doubt cuts both ways. Those who once believed the case solved now face an uncomfortable reckoning. Not because they were wrong to want justice, but because justice built on partial understanding carries its own weight. The city begins to remember not just the crime, but the climate in which conclusions were reached.
Fear.
Pressure. The demand for resolution at any cost. The absence remains untouched. No remains. No final scene. Just the same unanswered question that started everything. Where did the truth go when everyone stopped looking? Late one evening, a community meeting is held for an unrelated issue. During the open floor, someone mentions the case. The room stills. People exchange glances. The name is spoken again, followed by silence heavy with recognition. No one argues. No one resolves anything. But the case is no longer dormant. It has re-entered shared awareness. Cold cases are not reopened only by law. Sometimes they are reopened by conscience. The city does not unravel because of this. It absorbs it as cities do. But something changes in the way people talk about the past. Less certainty, more caution, an understanding that time does not purify truth, it complicates it. That some stories resist being closed because they were never fully understood. As the years continue to pass, the case settles into a new identity. No longer just an unsolved disappearance. No longer just a contested conviction. It becomes a symbol of something harder to face. The limits of knowing. The danger of finality. The cost of mistaking silence for resolution. And somewhere within that unresolved space, the cold case endures. Not frozen, not solved, but alive in the tension between what was decided and what may still be true, waiting for the moment when the right question is finally asked. Eventually, the case stops being about one night in 1988 and becomes about everything that followed. The years layered on top of it like sediment, compressing memory, distorting shape, preserving fragments in unexpected places. The cold case exists now less as an event and more as a pressure point, a reminder of how easily certainty can harden around absence. People who once spoke with confidence begin to soften their language. They say things like, as far as we know, based on what we had then, given the information available. These qualifiers appear not because facts have changed, but because perspective has. Time has exposed the difference between resolution and understanding. The city has learned that closing a file does not close a wound. The family carries this knowledge quietly. They have outlived outrage. They have outlasted attention. What remains is vigilance, not in the sense of action, but of memory. They correct small inaccuracies when they hear them. They refuse simplified versions of the story. They have become custodians of complexity, guarding against the comfort of neat conclusions. Some investigators return to the case in their final years, not officially, not with authority, but with honesty. They speak openly now about what they didn't know, what they assumed, what they wish they had questioned sooner. These conversations never make headlines. They happen in kitchens over coffee gone cold, between people who understand that accountability does not end at retirement. The journalist publishes her piece. It avoids accusation. It avoids exoneration. It focuses instead on process, on how narratives solidify, on how cold cases can evolve into something fixed not by truth, but by fatigue. The response is immediate and polarized. Some praise the restraint. Others accuse her of reopening wounds best left alone. The story does what unresolved stories always do, it divides. Public institutions respond carefully. Statements are issued. Reviews are mentioned but not promised. Language is chosen to acknowledge concern without admitting fault. The machinery of certainty resists disruption, even as doubt seeps into its edges. The cold case remains officially unchanged, but unofficially transformed. In classrooms, the case is discussed now not as a crime story but as a lesson. About evidence.
About time.
About the ethics of closure. Students debate it without the emotional weight carried by those who lived through it, and in doing so, they reveal something unsettling. Distance does not neutralize impact, it reframes it. The case continues to shape thinking long after its supposed end. The absence persists, unchanged by reinterpretation. No grave.
No farewell.
Just a space where something should be. That space has outlasted verdicts, articles, debates. It remains the most honest part of the story. Everything else has been argued into ambiguity. On certain nights, the city feels smaller, quieter, as if aware of its own unfinished narratives. People walk streets layered with invisible history, unaware of how many unresolved stories sit beneath their feet. The cold case is one of many, but it is the one that refuses to fade completely because it mirrors something collective, the fear that answers, once declared final, may not be. The man at the center of the conviction grows older. Time erodes the sharp edges of his presence, but not the questions surrounding him. Whether he is a symbol of guilt or of systemic error depends entirely on who is speaking. He remains silent now, less out of strategy than resignation. The story will outlive him either way. And so the case settles into its final form, not as solved or unsolved, but as unresolved. A contradiction that makes people uncomfortable. A reminder that some truths do not arrive whole, and some mysteries are not meant to be concluded, only understood more honestly over time. The cold case does not end with revelation. It ends with awareness, with the understanding that silence can be mistaken for certainty, and that time, rather than healing all wounds, sometimes only teaches us how to live alongside them. In the end, what remains is not the verdict, not the arguments, not even the doubt. What remains is the echo, a low, persistent presence that moves through the city, like a memory it cannot fully shake. The cold case has become part of the landscape now, woven into the way people talk about the past, about justice, about what it means to know something for sure. New generations hear the story, without realizing how close it still is. To them, 1988 sounds distant, almost abstract. But for those who lived through it, the year still carries weight. It surfaces unexpectedly, in the middle of unrelated conversations, in the way a pause lingers just a little too long after the case is mentioned. Time has not sealed it off. It has only blurred the edges enough to make it harder to confront directly. There are no more official updates. No reopened hearings. No dramatic reversals waiting in the wings. The machinery of the system has done what it knows how to do, and then it has moved on. What happens next exists outside procedure. It lives in personal reckonings, in late-night thoughts, in the quiet understanding that certainty is often something we construct because we cannot tolerate ambiguity for too long. The family continues forward, not because the story ended, but because life insists on movement. They carry the missing with them in subtle ways. In habits, in anniversaries unmarked by calendars, in a vigilance toward truth that no longer seeks headlines, only honesty. They do not speak of closure. They speak of endurance. Some investigators admit, privately, that this is the kind of case that never truly leaves you. Not because of what was proven, but because of what wasn't. Because of the sense that somewhere, a simpler explanation was overlooked or a harder question was left unasked. Cold cases have a way of rearranging priorities, of teaching humility long after urgency fades. The city absorbs the story into its collective memory, where it will sit alongside countless others, unresolved in different ways. It becomes a reference point, a cautionary tale, a reminder invoked when new cases emerge and pressure builds to explain the unexplainable. The past, in this way, quietly influences the future. No monument is built. No plaque marks the place where everything changed. The absence is memorial enough. It exists in the spaces between facts, in the quiet agreement that something important is still missing. And that absence continues to shape how the story is told and how it is heard. Cold cases are often described as frozen in time, but this one was never truly still. It moved slowly, subtly, reshaping lives, careers, and beliefs over decades. It resisted final language. It refused to be simplified. And in doing so, it revealed something unsettling but honest, that some truths do not arrive as answers, but as questions that endure. As the city moves forward, as years continue to stack quietly on top of one another, the case remains, no longer active, never resolved, permanently present. Not as a headline, not as a scandal, but as a shadow that reminds everyone who encounters it of the limits of certainty. The cold case began with a disappearance. It ends not with a solution, but with an understanding. That justice can be partial, that memory can outlast evidence, and that sometimes the most truthful ending is the one that admits what cannot be known, while refusing to forget what was lost.